Okay, well, we're going to get started. We'll let people in as I start speaking. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for Mountain Housing Council Speaker Series. The series is an opportunity to dive deeper into a variety of housing topics, from today's session on tiny homes to past topics on short-term rental ordinances and key housing terms. The format for today's session will be about a 30-minute presentation and then a robust question and answer. We have some really great housing people in the audience, so I'm looking forward to the conversation later. You can put your questions in the chat box at any time. However, we will wait until the end of the presentation to address them. This meeting is being recorded in speaker view and can be reviewed after the session at mountainhousingcouncil.org. Before I introduce our speakers, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the Mountain Housing Council, who we are, and why we're talking about tiny homes today. So the Mountain Housing Council is a project of the Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation, whose mission is to connect people and opportunities, generating resources to build a more caring, creative, and effective community. Many of you know us for our grant making and scholarship work. Our mission-based initiative work, in addition to the Mountain Housing Council, includes Force Futures and Family Strengthening through the Community Collaborative. We are led by a visionary board of directors, and I believe we have one of our board of directors on. It looks like Alex Morados is joining us today. Thanks, Alex. My name is Christina Kind. I'm the coordinator of the Mountain Housing Council and the Community Collaborative. Joining us today are also Tara Zuardo, Mountain Housing Council's director, and Sasha Cantu, the Community Foundation's director of impact investing. The Mountain Housing Council brings together 29 diverse stakeholders, businesses, local governments, community groups, special districts, and housing advocates to take on the unique and pressing challenges of achievable local housing in North Lake Tahoe. We know that there's a need for housing at every income level, from homelessness to middle income salary earners, and we elevate and educate our regional housing needs in the community through outreach, education, and by tracking data. Our partners also come together to tackle the unique and pressing challenges of housing in our region, and this includes housing availability, diversity, and affordability. As you can see in this slide, our region and scope is characterized by the same boundaries as the Tahoe Truckee Unified School District, which includes the town of Truckee down the north and west shores of Lake Tahoe, westward to include Donner Summit, and to the east to include the California-Nevada state line. So our goal is to build on the needs identified in the Truckee North Tahoe Regional Workforce Housing Needs Assessment. In 2021, our most recent assessment, we identified the need for regionally 9,528 units. This breakdown as follows: 4,693 current worker households who are inadequately housed, 3,517 current worker households who commute into the region but would prefer to live here, and 1,275 part-time seasonal workers who are inadequately housed. Inadequately housed means overburdened. They're spending more than 30% of household income on housing, overcrowded, more than one person per room, not just bedrooms, but all rooms in the unit, and underhoused, presence of incomplete plumbing or kitchen facilities. So based on our region's high cost of housing, lack of inventory in the missing middle income levels, and the fact that HUD generally recognizes but does not address the moderate income levels, so anything above 80% AMI, expanded the definition of affordable housing to include the missing middle income levels through the Achievable Local Community Housing Framework, as you can see in this graphic. So people who fall in the teal and red areas of our bridge graphic make too much to qualify for affordable housing development, but too little to buy or rent market rate homes. In 2017, when the term was coined, the definition of achievable included households earning up to 195%. So our bridge stopped here. As the real estate market shifts, the household income needed to participate in the housing market has pushed the definition of achievable up to 245% of AMI. So this expanded definition of affordability improves our region's ability to address the housing needs for a diversity of households. And Karen Pinkston and TRP is actually even adjusting this definition even further to include a workforce housing parameter that you work in the region. For all the housing units in our region, the leading product type is overwhelmingly single-family homes, which account for nearly 80% of the housing stock. As you can see in the graphic, mobile homes only make up 860 units, or 2.5% of the housing stock. The reason I show you this graphic is because a diversity of product type is important to meet the needs of households at various life stages, with the median home price in Truckee in March at $950,000 and in Tahoe City at 1.4 million. Many people in our region simply can't afford the single family home, and we need more product type in this area. So 2 to 4, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. 2 to 4 units, mobile homes 5 to 9 units, 20 plus units. The diversity of housing allows more people into the housing market, and the reality is that most of us can't enter the market here, and so we need more options in here. And so that is where tiny homes and other innovative housing solutions could come in. So our speakers today are going to get into the nuts and bolts of tiny homes and regulations, including a new movable tiny home ordinance in the city of South Lake Tahoe and housing related code amendments in Placer County. Patrick Dobbs, AICP Senior Planner, previously worked at TRPA and Nevada County before joining Placer County 4 years ago. He's worked on both long-range and current planning projects and is currently leading the proposed housing-related code amendments, which will be going to the county's Board of Supervisors next month for adoption. Jessica Wackenhut Lomeli, and I'm so sorry if I mispronounced that, which I'm sure I did, is the Associate Housing Planner for the City of South Lake Tahoe. She previously worked at California Tahoe Conservancy and Strategic Growth Council, and prior to that at Los Angeles Local Initiative Support Corporation, a national intermediary and CDFI. She has also worked on topics across the community development spectrum, from housing to criminal justice through racial justice lens. So thank you both so much for joining us this late afternoon. And Patrick, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Patrick Dobbs with Placer County's Planning Services Division, and thanks to the Mountain Housing Council for reaching out to us to talk about housing. Placer County has a number of housing initiatives that are going on, so we're excited to be part of the discussion. I know the focus is tiny homes, but I am just going to give a little context and background here. I'm working on this packet of code amendments called the Housing Related Code Amendments. It's been a few years in the making. It's going to the Board of Supervisors next month for adoption, and we're really looking forward to moving into the implementation phase of the project. So just to touch on those, I've got a few slides on some of the more affordable and innovative housing types that are proposed, but the code amendments is a county initiated project. Our board has adopted a housing strategy and development plan to provide more variety and affordability of housing types. The focus of the code amendments is on streamlining multifamily and mixed use developments. Placer's population is growing. We do have room to sprawl, but because of infrastructure limitations, it would take a long time to deliver that housing on the ground. So we're really focused on infill opportunities and capitalizing on vacant and underdeveloped properties in our existing established communities. And I could go on about why that's our approach, but I think most of you already know. I mentioned, proximity to infrastructure and how that will accelerate the housing. There are a number of environmental impacts when someone has to drive 10 miles to get a gallon of milk. There are social impacts when people that are vital to the fabric of the community can't afford to live there, and economic impacts by not having that built-in workforce and consumers during the shoulder season. So this is the triple bottom line. And again, I think most of you are familiar with this kind of compact development model approach. Again, for some additional context, just, we have a regional housing needs allocation from the state, and we fall short in some of the lower income categories, and we'll still be short when this next 8-year cycle ends. There's only so much that government can do: construction, material costs, and contractor availability. I mean, there's a lot of things that we don't control. So we're also fortunate to live here. The downside is it's expensive. And as you know, lower income households get hit the hardest. We currently have thousands of households overburdened by these living expenses, and the numbers are growing. And so with that, I'll throw a few slides up here. Okay, is it? let's see, I'm sharing, right? Or not yet? I'm sharing. Okay, good.
You're good.
So the housing code amendments do include some different types of innovative and affordable housing. People want choices, and we have a lot of expensive, low density, single family residential housing in the county. But having a diversity and a variety of housing options and prices is key to providing achievable housing for our existing and future residents. So I'll talk about some of these housing choices that will be allowed when the board passes the code amendments next month, specifically movable tiny homes and cluster lot development. So movable tiny homes, we brought this to our board for adoption in 2018 under a CEQA exemption. There was some concern at that time that we might be exposed to litigation given the lack of environmental analysis under the exemption. So it got continued and it got folded into this more comprehensive packet of housing related code amendments. So what is a movable tiny house? It's not an RV. They don't look like RVs, and we recognize that societally, most people don't treat RVs like tiny houses. Most people live in their movable tiny houses full time. So under the proposed ordinance, the movable tiny house could be a primary residence or an accessory dwelling unit. You might ask what zone districts they're allowed in, and the answer is wherever residential uses are allowed. Christina asked that I mention a few differences between RVs and tiny homes on wheels and ADUs. RVs are pretty limited. They're allowed in RV parks and mobile home parks. They're allowed for short-term incidental camping and allowed for limited duration for farm worker housing or temporary hardship situations with a minor use permit. Accessory dwelling units, junior accessory dwelling units, they're typically stick built and thus subject to California building code. There are size limits, and in the case of the JADU, owner occupancy requirements. And they're accessory, all right? So you need a primary residence to have an ADU. And ADUs in Placer County have exploded. In a few years back, we used to get less than 10 applications a year. Now we permit more than 100 a year. Our definition limits the size of movable tiny homes to 400 square feet. They include basic functional areas that support normal daily routines. This includes a bathroom, a kitchen, sleeping areas. It's mounted on a trailered chassis. So tiny homes aren't everybody's first choice, but they are a desirable choice for many people. They're not cheap, but they're cheaper due to their small size. They're transportable, so people can move their tiny house with them when they decide to move. And they serve several demographics. They're useful for single individuals, small families, retirees, workforce housing. Another benefit is the expedited building and installation process. Again, just to kind of hit on some of the highlights of the regulations, they would need to be licensed and registered with the DMV or HCD. My photos that I stole from the web don't support this, but the undercarriage needs to be screened. So there's a variety of ways you can do that, but we want to hide the trailer portion and the wheels of that. It's got to look like a house. So again, these are distinguished from RVs. Tiny homes on wheels are designed and built as a home first, and that have the ability to be transported. There is a certification element to it, a third-party certification for the American National Standards Institute and National Fire Protection Agency standards. So that needs to be affixed. There's kind of a self-certification element to that, but that needs to be demonstrated that has been that those standards are being met. And so Placer has a lot of diverse communities. During the public outreach phase of the project, we did receive some pushback from on movable tiny homes. I mean, particularly from some of our higher income suburban type communities. Think of places like Granite Bay. So there were concerns about things like property values and occupant safety. And again, movable tiny homes aren't subject to California's building code. So public safety is a primary priority of ours. So there's a requirement for at least 2 points of egress and very high fire hazard severity zones, which I assume most of you live in those areas. There's fire safety and suppression requirements, which can add, additional costs and may make these infeasible for some. But these tiny houses would need to connect to the county approved water supply and wastewater. So again, that's just kind of a quick overview on some of the tiny home regulations that we have proposed. There's more details, but those are the highlights. So shifting gears to cluster lot development. There's 3 main types of cluster lot development, cluster lot housing that would be allowed under the proposed code language. Allows some flexibility for other types of cluster lot development that meet the spirit and intent of the cluster lot ordinance. These amendments would allow movable tiny house communities in multifamily residential and commercial plan development, resort and mixed use zone districts. Again, just highlighting a few of the regulations. 1 parking space would be required. Can't be used for short-term rentals. They have to be owner occupied or long-term rental. They need to remain on site for at least 120 days. And density, really in all of the cluster lots developments, is determined by the minimum parcel size of the underlying zone district. So for instance, in our multifamily residential zone, part of the housing code amendments, we're proposing to reduce the minimum parcel size to 3,500 square feet for residential uses. So if you had an acre, you could potentially have up to 12 movable tiny homes on a movable tiny home community on that acre. And I say potentially because there's a lot of other factors just besides density that determine the development potential of a site. Parking, setbacks, if it's on a septic system, all of those things take up space, and it's somewhat unusual for someone to be able to maximize its density just because of all those factors. So that's the first type of cluster lot development, movable tiny house community. The second type I want to talk about is cottage housing and co-housing cluster lot development. These are permissible in the same zone districts as the movable tiny house communities I just spoke of. All of the different cluster lot developments require clustered groups of 4 to 12 units. So you might have a larger parcel that maybe would allow up to 20 units of density, but you couldn't put all 20 of those units together. There need to be nodes, or there need to be clustered groups of housing between 4 and 12 units. A lot of this is new for us, so we're learning. But I mean, cottage housing is often laid out kind of around a central courtyard. I mean, co-housing has a number of really cool concepts that are part of that housing type. But one of the things they share in common is that they're really designed to foster social interaction. That's quite different than a lot of the housing we have in Placer County that are designed for privacy and exclusivity. There's open space requirements. We still want people to have private areas, but we want double the area for common and shared spaces. There's floor area limits of 1,000 square feet for 1 story and 2,000 square feet for 2 story. And just kind of a common theme that you'll see in all of these cluster lot development types is an attempt to have more flexible development standards that may be prescribed for other housing types in the same zone district. And the third type of cluster lot development is called the agricultural conservation and open space cluster lots. We are a right to farm county. This is really about trying to protect and preserve agriculture in our communities. We have very diverse and remarkable natural resources. In this type of cluster lot development, 60% of the property needs to be preserved for ag, conservation, or open space. And that's accomplished through, there's different ways that can be accomplished, but conservation easements, HOAs, nonprofits, etc. The ag conservation and open space cluster lot development is permissible within the residential agriculture, residential forest, and farm zone districts. So these are the more rural areas of the county with larger parcels where you need a minimum parcel size of 20 acres for that type of cluster lot development. So that's quick. That was kind of my slides. Again, the housing related code amendments will go to our board for adoption next month. You know, I feel fortunate to work in a place that has the political will and resources to kind of think outside the box on different types of housing and this ever-changing housing landscape. So, you know, thank you for including us. That concludes my presentation, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Patrick. That was very helpful. Next, we'll hear from Jessica.
Great, thanks, Christina. Thanks, Patrick. That was really helpful. So first, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the City of South Lake Tahoe's housing program and what that sort of looks like to provide some of those parameters. And then I'll go into our recently passed Movable Homes Ordinance. All right, so as Patrick mentioned, we all have our RANA numbers for the housing element. And the city is fortunate, similar to Placer County, to have the political will and movement to sort of think outside of that. We also had our housing needs assessment done for the South Shore. And so we're thinking about not just meeting those RANA numbers, but how are we meeting the greater need in our community? We have close to, it's like 16 different housing initiatives within our housing program. That fluctuates, of course, because we're trying to figure out what we're throwing out sticks and what's actually improving conditions and where we're sort of able to innovate. And then we're also going to be working on creating a permanent housing funding stream, which will allow us more flexibility in thinking about these different types of opportunities. And now I'm going to go into our Movable Tiny Homes Ordinance, which was recently passed on March 1st of this year. And so very, very similar, actually almost exactly the same as what Patrick was mentioning in his initial slides. I'll explain the process first, but a lot of the actual requirements and pieces within the ordinance are very similar to Placer County's, which I imagine is similar across the state. But initially this was brought about by some community members as well as a member of our council to think about how we could allow this within the City of South Lake Tahoe. So it went to our planning commission initially on August 2nd of 2021. Then it went to city council, went back and forth a few times as discussions were taken about where they should be allowed, how they're going to be permitted, what do we want them to sort of look like, what sort of standards they need to meet. So a lot of it was really the shift around permanent foundations, right? And so we don't have a permanent foundation requirement within mobile home parks, and that's the only area where tiny homes were allowed throughout this whole time. So similar to Placer, we also had the 400 square foot requirement. Initially, those were only allowed in mobile home parks. So now we created another permit exclusively for movable tiny houses. And so this is pretty similar. So ADUs needed permanent foundation, but if it's a movable tiny house that's functioning as an ADU, it will not need it. And similar to what Patrick showed, you need to have everything covered. There's nothing that you can really pull out from the sides like you see with common RVs or anything where you can have extensions on portions, or if you have a deck, it all needs to be fixed and in place. Let's see, what else? So it is a 400 square feet, but I'll also share that that's excluding any lofts. So a lot of times when you watch any of those tiny home shows on HGTV or you see them online, a lot of times you see people sleeping above. And so that's not incorporated into that overall 400 square feet, which provides a bit more room for people who are located or living within those homes. Also, as Placer mentioned, you need to have it registered with the DMV. They can't be used as vacation home rentals or hosted rentals. We are allowing them, so it depends on what your zoning is. So it can be allowed on single family or any lot where ADU is allowed. Also for multifamily as well. And then parking, it has to comply with any parking requirements that are relevant to the zoning that it is in already. And let's see. any mechanical equipment has to be incorporated into the structure. So sometimes you can see people with generators outside, so that needs to be inside. There's a lot other pieces in the ordinance, but these are some of the things I sort of wanted to highlight and walk through. I will also add one more caveat to this presentation, and that while the city did pass this ordinance, we're still within TRPA, and TRPA is working on passing that through. So while the city does have an ordinance to allow mobile tiny houses, we still can't allow them per TRPA regulation. So we're waiting for that to pass through until we're able to have any of those come through the Development Services Department. And with that, I'll conclude and open up to any questions.
Thank you. Sorry, oh, Karen is on. I don't know, Karen, if you wanted to speak to TRPA. I know that the working group has discussed this, and I don't know if you want to just give an update on timeline, not to put you on the spot at all, which I am doing, but.
Yeah, I mean, the working group, this has come up at the working group, and then also just the city being really proactive about passing their movable tiny home ordinance has definitely kind of moved this up in priority. So we are, actively looking at whether our code actually already allows that or whether it needs an actual code amendment. And we're, planning to include that amendment in the next housing kind of set of housing amendments that go forward. But I did actually have a question for Jessica and Patrick.
Yeah, please.
Do either of you foresee pressure in the future to allow, like I know both of your ordinances are very specific. They kind of describe the park model RV and what it could look like and everything. But do you see pressure in the future to allow other types of RVs, just kind of the more traditional RV, to be used as a permanent residence? And why do you think that would be? What are sort of the positives and negatives? Like, number one, do you think that that's going to be something you're facing in the future? And like, what are the pros and cons of allowing other types of RVs to be permanent residences?
So I guess I could try and go first. Karen, thanks for the question. I don't really see it. We've been working on this for a while. It would have come up, is what I think. So I think if there was a desire for that, we would have, it would have kind of risen to the surface. So, I may be kind of speaking ignorantly on that, but again, the way these RVs are, they're temporary, and we're trying to do something else that's not temporary. And so, who knows? The landscape is changing so quickly. Could it come up? Sure, but there hasn't been an appetite for that at this point. This is the evolution. In my eyes, in terms of movable tiny houses and such. So there doesn't seem to be that much appetite. Again, in certain situations, I mean, if you have a building permit and you can live temporarily on your parcel depending on your zoning in an RV, but for permanent housing, I'm not seeing that pressure at this point. I don't know if that got all of your question, but.
Yeah, I guess kind of the question that's been coming up as we've been discussing it is like, what is the line? What is the line between what we kind of consider an RV that is not, maybe not designed
Right.
and a park model? Like, what is the actual difference?
It's a delicate difference. I mean, there's a lot of similarities, and we're trying to distinguish the two. So, again, we had to work with HCD and stuff on our final language because, there in the past, there's, some of these tiny homes and such really haven't been, recognized as permanent housing. So, I think we'll see as it evolves. Certainly, in the time since we had originally proposed this in 2018 to now, I mean, the public opinion acceptance has shifted dramatically. So we'll see what changes can be made, but at this point, it still is a little bit of a blurry line, in my opinion. And like I said, we're trying to distinguish them through these design elements and such. Maybe Jessica has a better answer.
I agree. I don't foresee a huge, you know, a lot of people moving towards that. And I think I'll take the first stab, and Zach, our housing manager, is also on here. So I'll have him chime in next to see if he has any difference of opinion. But I think the biggest issue is, like, when we're thinking about tiny homes that we've discussed pretty openly within our office, is, are these real? So this is another tool in the toolbox, right? Tiny homes are not the solution to everything. And so when we're thinking about them, we don't want to think about, because a lot of places are really using them for people who are experiencing homelessness, right? And so we don't really want to just say, hey, all the disenfranchised populations, we're only going to build you tiny homes versus permanent housing, which is an injustice within itself, right? You only deserve 400 square feet versus someone else who deserves an apartment. And so I think that needs to be part of that framing too, is how are we meeting those building standards within the state to allow people to have dignified housing, and so that those building standards are being met for people, and so people have more access to housing. So I think with that, that's like, while there's, like, you know, blurred lines, as Patrick mentioned, around the differences between what you're asking about, Karen, I also think of it more as the housing justice issue, like, who's going to be living here? Is it interim housing? Is it permanent structures? How do those sort of play into that, and what sort of needs will be met? So I'll just pass it to Zach if you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jessica. And I mean, really, Patrick and Jessica hit the, you know, pretty much nail on the head. So a couple things to add would be, really, so in this situation, they're defined as park model RVs, different than let's say an RV that you might see driving down the road. And that is you know, a pretty fundamental difference. They're built pretty different. They're not made to necessarily move all the time. They're movable, but they do require connections in our ordinance to water, sewer, utilities, all that. Those connections have to be permitted. So, you know, the idea is that we're not really, this isn't really like a gateway to, let's say, motorhomes or something happening. Through this process, there was some general comments about that, perhaps some concern. But again, with the, as you know, same thing with Placer County with the design element that requires it to, you know, look like a house, not a vehicle. With that, and again, the park model RV requirement, it's supposed to kind of not let that be a gateway to RVs. And so no, there's no intention at this point to go to RVs. That said, people live in RVs every day around town. Hundreds of people also live in hotel rooms. As a city, we're aware of these kind of other unique housing situations that people are doing in an emergency. And, you know, we take a kind of a delicate approach to that. So we try to kind of maximize. We have an SRO ordinance that tries to regulate hotel rooms being used as housing. We know hundreds of them are, so that provides some level of basic health, life, safety code. Again, and from a code enforcement standpoint, we don't go around kicking RVs out of parking lots and stuff like that. That, again, that's just kind of a policy direction, knowing the hard situation people are in, but definitely not intending to kind of allow RVs to become kind of the new tiny homes or something like that, or motorhomes. But really good answers from, you know, Jessica and Patrick.
I just add one thing on that. I mean, you know, so much of this has to do with character, right? And I mean, you know, in our residential neighborhoods, that, you know, to go to RVs as permanent housing would be a real deviation from the character. So the reason we've been able to, you know, have some traction with this is because of those public safety elements that, you know, are required, and because the design elements to ensure that, you know, it is indeed a house. So I think the character issue is a big thing that would preclude us from kind of going there, but we'll see.
Okay, thanks.
Great question, Karen, and thank you for your answers, Zach, Jessica, and Patrick. Chase put a comment in the chat box that you guys answered, but don't the park model certification requirements define some of the differences? I think he was making more of a comment than a question. And Alex, I see that you went off mute. Do you have a question?
Yeah, for Patrick. First of all, I just want to say this is outstanding that both sides of the lake are having a common discussion around a common solution. As a long-term resident, this day has been long-term coming, and this is a great topic that we need to tackle together. So I applaud the effort. Patrick, I wanted a refinement on the proposed ordinance change related to that, the common area or the clustering solution. I think we've talked before about the number of motels in North Lake Tahoe, and I know South Lake Tahoe has the same scenario that are currently used for workforce housing, and often use a single house that's a large house on that property as a common area for kitchens and living spaces, etc. Is this intended to enable the investment in those types of properties that would require them to upgrade to a degree of code to ensure safety, but also allow the investor to come in and maintain what is basically a status quo, but with an understanding that, and a recognition that we're using common space to house workforce that is already operating in that manner, but could operate in a much safer manner once involved or engaged within the ordinance and compliant. Was that the intent, or am I reading too much into that?
You might, you know, I don't know if I caught it all actually. You know, you might be kind of ahead of us on that. You know, I mean, you know, I appreciate you calling out this coordination with city, and I would just say that all the California jurisdictions, you know, we're all in the same boat in terms of, you know, dealing with mandates from the state and dealing with regional government and TRPA. So, you know, these code amendments, you know, that we're proposing wouldn't apply within the basin, but, you know, we're eager to get them adopted as in the basin if those sort of things, you know, if there's a desire to do that. But I'm not sure if I totally followed it on in terms of the, you know, as it relates to tourist accommodation being used as residential units. I mean, the cluster lot development is basically kind of a refined PD or PUD, a planned development or planned unit development that, you know, this is planned developments are, I mean, they have a number of challenges, at least in the county, that you got to pay double the rec fees. There are similar and different open space requirements, but it's negotiable. And that's one thing that's definitely different about this cluster lot. Again, we're trying to be more prescriptive, you know, objective. And, you know, if you meet the standards, you know, there isn't this kind of horse trading going on. So I don't know if that got your point, Alex. But you know, the idea is to provide some flexibility. I mean, like I said, you know, you think of Placer County from up at the lake to Granite Bay to Sheridan to Auburn, Forest Hill. I mean, we have such a diverse community. I mean, these aren't all going to work in all of our communities, but certainly some of them will. And so, you know, the idea is to put more choices on the menu that people can choose from, and to provide some options and to provide some, you know, certainty that if they play by the rules, that they're going to have a favorable outcome, and to kind of balance those needs and desires. So.
Great. That was fine. I do believe South Shore and North Shore both share the scenario of these small motels that have a bunch of studios without full kitchens. And the concept of shared space would be sharing the kitchen in the main house. That was primarily the shared space, along with, you know, upgrading the common area for everybody's shared use. There's a serious opportunity, but it's kind of off topic but it is parallel to tiny homes in the sense that it's an asset that's there that could certainly serve and convert what is currently substandard. And that's what needs to be done, is to upgrade them. And many are willing. And the alternative of scraping and building isn't very attractive, nor is it necessarily in character with those typically commercial cores of both South Lake Tahoe and the small towns we have here in North Tahoe. But still, somewhat off topic. But again, I appreciate the articulation, and it's clear that there's will and a desire to make the changes, and this tiny home effort is outstanding. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I forget what term TRPA calls it, but I mean, I think what you're describing is kind of that dormitory style type living where, you know, that you know, you have the shared kitchen area and then the kind of individual living areas. And, you know, I know there's some allowance for that, but like you said, you know, that's kind of something different than this cluster lot development.
Understood. Thank you.
But any adaptive, you know, you know, adaptive reuse and such. I mean, you know, we're seeing, you know, a lot of commercial space or churches. I mean, a number of things, office space, you know, declining demand. And, you know, I'm writing a permit right now for the old restaurant that some of you may have gone to, Dingus McGee's down in Auburn. That's going to be 6 units now. So this adaptive reuse and you know, conversion to housing and providing flexibility, whether it be individual units or you know, kind of more common facilities. We want people to have all those choices.
Thank you. So there is a question in the box from Dick Simpson. A friend bought a lot at Donner Summit and discovered no permit was required for up to 120 square feet. When we're talking about 400 square feet max, that's what you both said for South Lake in Placer County. Is there a rule for these ultra tiny homes? And that's tiny.
I guess that's probably me and Donner Summit. You know, I don't work in the building department. I do think there is a minimum size on houses, and I don't know that they can go that small. You know, they have some certain calculations with you know, that so, you know, I think those 120 square feet, I mean, those typically for sheds and such. I'm not sure you can really have cooking, sleeping, living areas in 120 square feet. And, you know, it might be a little, you know, I mean, no permit was required. I mean, you know, if there still could be a number of building permits if there's electricity or, you know, or, you know, any permits for any, you know, water connections or sewer. So, you know, I understand that 120 square feet to really be targeted more at, you know, accessory structures and small sheds that don't have power and such. Maybe the city knows more about that than I do, but I do think that there is, I haven't seen a 120 square foot house yet. And, you know, whether there's a role, I mean, you know, I've seen some really, you know, like Pallet, I think is that the company out of Oregon that's doing a lot of, you know, homeless sort of, you know, they have these very affordable and quick to construct buildings. They might be down at that size. So, you know, I don't think we're ready to exclude anything at this point. We have so many challenges that there may be a role for all of it. But again, you start to factor in a lot of the, again, different building code requirements or, you know, snow loads and such. I'm kind of rambling, but I do think there's a minimum size, and I think it's greater than 120 square feet. And so it's not as though, you know, there's still maybe some permits involved. We want to get away from discretionary permits. We want to be more administrative with these. But if anyone else wants to take that.
Thank you. And then Claire asked, do TRPA's coverage limits apply to mobile tiny homes? And thank you, Karen, for answering in the chat. She said yes, that they would. Do we have any other questions from the audience? You can put it in the chat if you'd like. You can raise your hand. You can take yourself off mute, and I will call on you.
Christina?
Yeah, Peter, go ahead.
Thank you. So a quick question on this is, I sense from this discussion that there's a huge distinction that that is drawn between mobile tiny homes and permanent tiny homes. Meaning that if the product is permanent on a foundation with no wheels, it triggers the entire California building code. Is that correct?
Yeah, those are essentially ADUs, so accessory dwelling units, if it's not movable, depending on the size.
Yeah, if it's on a foundation, it's building code.
Okay, thank you.
And this might be a really dumb question, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. So if it is on a foundation and it is treated as ADU, based on your ordinance in the city of South Lake Tahoe, you could do that because it could be the primary residence. But anywhere else, it would need to be a secondary residence. Is that right? Or it would need to be attached to a primary residence, is what I mean.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, so we have a separate ADU ordinance that was passed March 2nd, 2021. So we've had that a bit longer to align with California code and the ADU ordinances. So that one is different, of course, and those are allowed as long as it's accessory to a primary dwelling.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, no problem.
Would anybody else like to ask a question?
I have a question. In that I was just down visiting in Santa Cruz, and there's a lot of people living in vans that are just around. And I was up in Grand Teton a few years ago, and they're out camping, and they put the 14-day limit on people with RVs or vans. Is there any activity, interest in providing a safe place to park? You know, that these would be self-contained mobile units, but it's a safe park for them as compared to them driving off in the woods and finding a place or parking on a residential street. I'm wondering where those thoughts are. Thank you.
Christina, do you want me to just mention our Tiger team?
Sure.
Yeah, just FYI, the Mountain Housing Council right now has a Tiger team composed of all of our jurisdictions like Nevada, Placer, and Truckee, as well as a lot of our kind of notable nonprofit groups like United for Action, North Tahoe Truckee, Homelessness Services, and we are trying to put together a temporary community workforce housing pilot program that does just that, basically. So we're kind of spotting different locations that we think the community would be amenable to. But other communities, as I'm sure you know, have done this. Telluride, Colorado, our own Palisades recently did it for employee housing, and it's worked really well off of Highway 89. So we are looking at a few different locations. Right now, we've got a couple we're focused on in Truckee, but we're trying to kind of find some in each jurisdiction so that we have at least some options.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Sarah.
and just to Mary's comment, I mean, while I think it's a good idea, I mean, so much of this has to do with where the financing support and such can come from. So, I see the county. I mean, we're converting a Hampton Inn to supportive permanent housing. Again, it's a good idea. When you get into issues about where people are going to the bathroom and how all that's being addressed, it can get a little tricky. So I think as you said, some of that is just going on, maybe with or without kind of approvals to do that, but with such a premium on land and with some of the health and safety requirements in place, I think our efforts are really geared more towards getting the people the help they need to get, back on their feet, as opposed to kind of providing an opportunity for them to, kind of continue to live in the van, so to speak. But I think it's a good idea. I don't know that we're doing anything on that in that direction currently.
I would say that right now in the city, we actually don't have any parking lots that are used that way. We've been focused quite a bit on developing housing and pushing more towards that. So right now on some of our excess state lands, we have 2 properties. It's about 11 acres. So that will be developing 248 units. So we have a few projects that are like moving along. And so our hope is that we're moving more into that instead of having to deal, because there are so many issues around having parking lots as temporary safe places. While it's great and people need a place to stay in the interim, I agree with what Patrick said. It is difficult because of there are a lot of costs that are incorporated into that. And I would say similar to, I just saw a question in the chat too about the cost for tiny homes and what that sort of looks like. And I think sometimes when we think about providing housing for people, although it might be really efficient and quick to build tiny homes, or to think about parking lots that are converted for people to live, I also think there's a lot of other costs that people aren't really thinking through and some of the issues. So I'll just throw that out, but I know it's not a perfect answer and it's pretty complicated.
And do you know what is the typical cost of a mobile tiny home, especially compared to RVs? And I know there's a full range for both. Oop, did we lose? Oh, no.
I should probably know. I'm just guessing, $70,000.
Yeah, I actually don't have any idea, but I've seen around that. I know the average per square foot cost of ADUs is pretty high. It's comparative to any other building costs right now with housing. So I think what Patrick said was about right.
Yeah, I think is the equation per square foot like $70? Is that, do you know what that, anyway, I don't, we can use that equation.
I mean, again, there's just so much kind of design detail and engineering that goes into these to make these as efficient as possible. So, I'd like to think I'm high on that number on 70,000. But I'd like to. I should research that a little bit.
Well, and I think our director Tara has done some research, and that's about the range she's found too.
I mean, they're expensive. They're
Mhm.
expensive, and I don't have an RV, so I don't know, but I'd say a quarter of that.
Yeah, because ADUs are around 120 to 150, depending on the cost. They're going up all the time, but yeah, so it seems about right around 70.
And I got another question in the chat. It was just sent to me though. But what about cost for permits and hookups? Do you have any estimates on that?
If that's to me, I don't necessarily know. I mean, again, every situation is a little different. If you're going out on vacant land in a rural area and you need to put in a septic system, that's expensive. If you're in a very high fire hazard severity zone and you need to have fire suppression, a big tank holding water with, sprinklers, I mean, that's, so it's just really going to range. But, in an ideal case, you're pulling a building permit for these connections, or a permit through our environmental health department, to hook up to sewer, and so I think less, a couple thousand or less. I mean,
Great, thank you. I do have a question for you. Back to the parking lots. Would it be possible, somewhere in like South Lake Tahoe, where you have the ordinance in effect, to do tiny homes in a commercial parking lot? If a large business, had a large parking lot and wasn't using a section of it, could they develop a little village there?
I'll pass that to you, Zach.
Sure. So in terms of a village, so tiny homes, movable tiny homes in this situation are allowed in as multifamily. So you could do like a village type multifamily thing if it's zoned appropriately for multifamily, and you could do it up to that density. So in the situation of like a parking lot, no. But a multifamily residential parcel, yeah, if it were designed correctly, met all the development standards, yes, it could function like that manner. Just really quick regarding the cost. Yeah, I mean, things that are going to impact that are the sewer connection fees, the water connections. That's going to vary parcel to parcel, kind of where things are, you know, what we're doing to kind of help that process. We're in the process of kind of collecting that data and kind of basically you know, providing, trying to provide some user friendliness so that if people are interested in this in the future, they can have a general sense of what the steps are necessary going to be, what the general cost might be. So we're in the process of kind of compiling all that information, but the costs vary. So it's a tricky question to answer because it's different every time. Depends how far you have to trench for your sewer lateral and things like that. So
would you be able to share the cost with us once you have it all?
yeah, we're putting that together and we'll be publishing that on the website in the coming. Absolutely.
Great. And Patrick, you did say that commercial when you gave your presentation that tiny homes could be potentially allowed on commercial spaces. So I should probably direct that question towards you. Could that be a possibility?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the county allows residential, you know, multifamily residential and commercial zone properties. So, you know, again, depending on, you know, there's a whole range of commercial zone districts, but like I said, if one of these or the mobile home, or sorry, movable tiny house community, I mean, that's allowed in some of the commercial zone districts, but not all. You know, again, I think there, you know, it's pretty, I don't know if taboo is the right word, but I mean, you know, in the past, decision makers really wanted to protect those commercial spaces, right? And you know, there's been more of a shift and an opening to, you know, really, again, that's what I said, you know, really one of the focuses of our housing code amendments is on mixed use, you know, trying to get, you know, these people, or, you know, people, enable them to live and work, you know, in proximity of each other, and all the social, environmental, and economic benefits of that. So, you know, again, could you just go out on a parking lot or such? You know, I mean, possibly with the right zoning and the right, you know, connections and infrastructure and such. I mean, you know, and again, you know, some of these are just allowed for zoning clearance where you just go pull a building permit. Some of them require discretionary, you know, so it kind of just depends on what type, what area.
Thank you. So we are at time. This is till 5 o'clock. We have 2 more minutes. And so I just really wanted to extend my gratitude to Patrick and Jessica for joining us today and sharing your expertise and your time. This was really helpful for me and very useful to me. Hopefully you guys in the audience found it useful, and thank you everyone else who came, especially to Karen. I know I put you on the spot, and so I appreciate you jumping in and answering your questions and telling us about TRPA. And so, yeah, I just want to share really quickly, we do have an upcoming event. Our Forest Futures Initiative has a monthly salon, and on June 9th, it will focus on evacuation routes. And so we'll have speakers from Truckee, Placer County, and Nevada County, and we'll also have Spanish interpretation. And so there will be presentations, much like today's series. It'll be about 20 minutes of presentations, and then it'll be a robust Q&A. And so you can register at ttcf.net. And that's all I have. And again, just thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Take good care. Bye.